feeling, a little bit Firestone spirit.
Yes. I'm just going to go over what we're going to talk about today and turn it over to Joyce. We're going to talk about what we consider, or what my father, Dr. Robert Firestone, has written about as the basic defense against death anxiety, or the fantasy bond. And Joyce is going to explain what we mean by that. Then I'm going to contrast the fantasy bond, or a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, from one that is not, and how that looks different in terms of the relating. Then we're going to show some film clips where people are talking about this process of when they got very close emotionally, how they felt it brought up death anxiety, and how that tended to lead them to create more of a fantasy bond in their relationships. We're also going to talk about societal defenses against death anxiety and how that relates. And lastly, how really feeling your feelings about death and having access to those feelings and being in touch with those feelings can better help you to cope with the issue. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
I have a quote here from, I think it's Division 48, the Peace Psychology Division of APA, where they quote current discussions of the, quotes, war on terrorism invite excessive emphasis on military intelligence and related approaches without addressing the psychological dynamics that fuel terrorism. Psychologists can help by identifying the need for comprehensive, long-term approaches that address these psychological processes. So I wish everybody in that division at APA had been at this conference, because I think it's been very valuable in starting to understand what is really underlying terrorism, ethnic strife, and what we can begin to do about it. And just, first of all, simply by understanding it. I'm going to start by quoting Ernest Becker from Denial of Death. He says, "The irony of man's condition is that the deepest need is to be free of the anxiety of death and annihilation. But it is life itself which awakens it. And so we must shrink from being fully alive, or being fully alive in the moment," as you said. I'm going to first of all define the fantasy bond in a broad way. The fantasy bond is simply an imagination of being connected or merged or fused with another person, with other persons, with a group, with a cause, with a nationality. And to relieve the terror of death is one of its functions as a defense. This illusion of being connected or belonging or being fused actually partially reduces or becomes, as Tom would say, a buffer against death anxiety. And Dr. Firestone's theory, separation theory, is not talking about being this highly individualistic person and separating from our loved ones. In contrast, we're talking about separating from these very destructive ties, these very destructive illusions of being merged with another person, which within a couple allows the deterioration of the real friendship and real affection and real love. And in a group, combined with other people who are thinking the same way, can lead to all kinds of evil acts, as we'll see. His theory integrates psychoanalytic and psychodynamic principles with existential systems of thought, and it does it in this way. It shows that early in the developmental sequence, children form defenses against interpersonal pain within the family. Separation experiences, rejection, hostility. Later on, their knowledge of death, which they form or evolves between the ages of 3 and 7, forces them to crystallize these defenses, these early defenses, so that throughout a person's life after that point, we're faced with two kinds of pain that we understandably defend ourselves against. Interpersonal pain in our relationships and existential conditions, as the previous speaker was talking about in the lecture, Sartre's terror of having the freedom of choice, the terror of death, which is what we're talking about today. So we're facing both of those kinds of dilemmas throughout our life. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from a book that Dr. Firestone has written. It's going to be published by APA next March, and the tentative title is Pursuing a Life of Meaning and Compassion. And he really sheds light on this developmental process of what happens to children and then how it affects our everyday lives as we're in adulthood. He starts out by saying human beings are very frightened animals. They have the capacity to make use of abstract symbols, and therefore they're conscious of their own mortality. This acute awareness of death's inevitability in turn gives rise to a fear reaction of serious proportions. Indeed, the manner in which the individual handles death anxiety as an evolving being, faced with the growing knowledge about existential issues, determines the course of his or her psychological life. Each child goes through a series of stages in his development as he learns about his finite span of life. First, an awareness that his parents are going to die. Later, he learns that he cannot sustain his own life. And finally, that humankind and the earth itself most probably will perish. Faced with this tragic awareness, the individual must choose between a life of denial and regress to an infantile or childish state of non-awareness, or accept the painful reality and embrace life in spite of death. A person could choose to cherish every moment of his life, all the more because of its temporal quality. Unfortunately, this is not a philosophical decision or choice that the child can make, where he's weighing the advantages and disadvantages with a judicious mindset. The resolution of this dilemma, this conflict, is born of turmoil and emotional upheaval that's torturous for the small child. And it's a real problem for children as young as 3 or 4 years of age. But what are the factors that are going to determine the resolution of this conflict in either the negative or the positive fashion? To help answer this question, we have to look at the psychological dimensions of each child's early life experience and come to understand how the vulnerable infant learns to cope with life in a relationship constellation. If the child is most fortunate and is blessed with mature and loving parents who provide the necessary, what Dr. Firestone calls love food, which is defined as just the capacity and the desire to provide both the love and direction to the child. With parents who provide the necessary love food required for adequate sustenance, the child would be able to live in a real world and would have less of a need to depersonalize or to develop defenses to avoid psychological pain and frustration. On the other hand, if the child is a victim of immature, inadequate, or hostile parenting, the impact of extensive frustration on the all-encompassing reactivity of the infant causes incredible psychological pain, and a defended posture is the only escape. But what's the nature of this defensive process within the hurt child? How does the helpless victim handle this crisis? The answer is that fantasy processes and a marked tendency to repress or suppress primitive pain take over in an attempt to ease the suffering. Who can stand continuing to identify with oneself as a helpless hurt child, the helpless victim of abuse or neglect, when one can escape the pain by identifying with the overpowering aggressor? Ferenczi's and Anna Freud's concept of identifying with the aggressor. We call this fantasy process of merging in the mind with one's parent or other family members the fantasy bond or the fantasy connection. Thus, the helpless child is able to join symbolically with the powerful mother or parenting figure. And this imaginary fusion actually reduces anxiety and provides partial relief of the tension associated with the frustration of these needs. Now, the power of the human imagination to reduce this pain is well known. There was an experiment during World War II done with conscientious objectors where they submitted them to a year-long regimen of almost near starvation level. of just a bare sustenance level. And they found that the men involved in this experiment fantasized, daydreamed, dreamed about food endlessly. But the interesting point is they found that the fantasies of food actually reduced the physical hunger pangs in these men. So that was a very interesting experiment. But not only that, this illusion of connection to the powerful parent is joined with just beginning self-feeding patterns and self-soothing patterns of thumb-sucking, rubbing a blanket, later on elaborating to many other things, as you can see, drug abuse and substance abuse, eating disorders. All these act together to alleviate the distressing feelings of hurt and rejection. So this defense offers a child a feeling, a sense of pseudo-independence, Of course, the degree to which a child comes to rely on psychological defense mechanisms that distort reality does depend on the degree of emotional deprivation. The greater the rejection, the stronger the imaginary attachment in fantasy, and the greater the loss of reality testing. The rejected child clings desperately to the family, idealizes his parents at his own expense, internalizes a negative self-concept, and projects the destructive characteristics of his parents onto other people, onto the environment at large, fostering a paranoid view of the world. And this is the beginning of this in-group, out-group, we-they kind of orientation, that it does take place very early in life. So understanding people in relation to death anxiety does help to explain many strange and puzzling phenomena about human behavior, not the least of which are people's tendencies for self-destructive responses and destructive responses against others. Why are people so prone to make these choices, these destructive choices in life that condemn them to repeat the unfortunate circumstances of their early lives? Because in order to protect this fantasy connection, erroneously considered to be a matter of life and death, a person can only tolerate gratification in fantasy. Real gratification, real love, real goal-directed behavior threaten the equilibrium of this fantasy solution to the conflict. So most people tend to avoid personal gratification, and paradoxically, they wouldn't say this, but paradoxically, they prefer on this level not to be loved, not to be valued by others, because it makes them more vulnerable. It makes them more cognizant of their own death. They choose instead to merge with others and to lose their distinctive characteristics rather than invest in a life they must certainly lose. And this is where this inner voice, the critical inner voice, comes in. They tell themselves certain things. They have certain beliefs. Why care when your destiny is so futile? Who gives a damn? Who needs people anyway? Who wants anything? You'll just get hurt if you invest emotionally. You can't trust anyone. Everyone's out for themselves. Even if you do find someone to love, relationships don't last forever, you know. If you don't want anything, you won't be disappointed. This is the true character defense armor. And these are statements that we've gathered from people who've revealed their critical inner voices. But also, let's see if I can find this. Just a moment. Oh, here we go. Separation theory also involves the individual in society. It shows that in choosing to defend against death anxiety, people are able to employ many different mechanisms of denial and defense. Individual lifestyles that are based on these psychological defenses then combine to affect social phenomena. So society represents a combination or a pooling of all of our individual defenses. Later, then, social pressure acts back on the individual to perpetuate this cycle. So most people who are defended prefer reliving over living, choose bondage over freedom, the old over the new, the past over the now. They try to recreate a parent or parents in other persons, other groups, other institutions, and they search for a personal savior on earth or in the heavens. People have a significant stake in their mode of defense, and they're threatened by other people with different outlooks and customs. They are afraid of alternative philosophies and ideologies because they perceive them as threats to their own defensive solution to their own defensive worldview. Faced with differences in race, color, religious beliefs, lifestyles, and habit patterns, they experience considerable anxiety, aggression, and hostility. One must either convert those who are misguided or mistaken, or take the necessary action to eradicate them, for they disturb our frame of mind. They are the enemy. On a societal level, such thinking is at the core of nationalism, patriotism, and all other isms. Ethnic differences are threatening, and we must eliminate the opposition. This accounts for the incredible amount of ethnic strife and terrorism in the world today. People are fighting about age-old religious differences and psychological defenses, and they are no longer aware of the real cause of their animosity. So we've found that most people cannot tolerate any form of direct confrontation with the concept of death or the interminable cessation of conscious awareness. And the majority of us retreat from these realizations and regress. The truth is that all solutions fail to completely do the job. Otherwise, there would be no need for religious wars or for ethnic strife based on these religious differences. Faced with this inescapable dilemma, seemingly inescapable dilemma, how can people live constructive, peaceful lives? Well, we've found that one answer is that people can come to appreciate the mystery of life and death without these false illusions or resolutions, if they can transcend their feelings of specialness and vanity and accept their vulnerability without feeling ashamed. We found that people can talk together with their friends, with their associates, about their feeling reactions to death and dying. And so in achieving this goal, they also face the fact of their mortality, accept their destiny, and they live with existential despair. In a very special sense, we must mourn in advance our own death and feel the true sadness of life. That's what we found in a lot of our seminars. If we feel something, we feel connected to ourselves and we feel in the moment. Paradoxically, in facing up to the existential despair in life, people could enjoy their lives to the maximum and develop a true sense of compassion for all other people. Such a person would choose to live fully with deep respect for self and others and would never turn to battle. I think the most poignant thing that I've ever read about the solution to this is Becker's last sentence in Denial of Death. The most that any one of us can seem to do, is to fashion something, an object or ourselves, and drop it into the confusion. Make an offering of it, so to speak, to the life force. And Lisa's going to show you some of the dimensions of the fantasy bond as it operates within a couple. People have told us that they have a terror of being alone, and they have also a fear of being close. So they found that the best solution is to form a fantasy bond where they can maintain a certain amount of emotional distance, while at the same time alleviating their feelings of loneliness, despair, and existential angst. So,
first, I just want to point this out to you. This is in your packet, so you have this to take, but it's looking at living an outward lifestyle where you are feeling your feelings, where you are invested in being yourself, where you aren't living in fantasy, as opposed to somebody who's living a more inward existence, more reliant on fantasy gratification, and how then they necessarily block out or don't relate closely to the people in their lives. And so I just wanted to point that out to you. Particularly in terms of feeling responses or personal relating, That's more characteristic of somebody who's living in an outward style. Somebody who is living more in fantasy is going to be cutting off or withdrawing from feeling, and their interpersonal relating is going to deteriorate. In terms of couple interactions that, again, that Joyce said that we've observed and with the many people that we've been working with, is that when people, on one side we're talking about an ideal way of relating, and on the other side we're talking about the styles of relating that characterize a fantasy bond, a relationship where people have formed this illusion of connection. In an ideal relationship, people are non-defensive and they're open to one another. They talk honestly, they're open to new experiences. In a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, there's often a lot of very angry overreactions to feedback from the other, and there also tends to be a very routinized way of living, very closed to new experiences. This is what we do this night of the week. This is what we do. It's very routinized and very closed and very structured. In an ideal relationship, people are honest and they act with integrity. But to act with integrity, you have to really know yourself. And that's part of really reacting honestly. And this is one of the things I think that all couples struggle with in terms of honesty. In a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, there tends to be a lot of deception and a lot of duplicity in the way people relate to one another. In an ideal relationship, there's respect for the other person's boundaries. You care about them as a person separate from yourself. You are invested in helping support the things that light them up, that really matter to them, even if those aren't in your own self-interest, because it's important to you that they're fulfilled as an individual. In a fantasy bond, there's a lot of overstepping of each other's boundaries, and there's a tendency to only see the other person in relation to ourselves. If we need them to be a savior to us, we are angry at any signs of human weakness that they display. If we are trying to distance ourselves from them, we may be seeing them only for their worst traits or being very critical of them. But we're seeing them in relation to what we need from them as opposed to who they really are. In an ideal relationship, there's physical affection, and the sexuality is personal. It's two people relating to one another. There's give and take. That's a very important part of a real relationship, is giving and also being able to take love. In a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, there tends to be a lack of affection, and often the way people describe the sexuality is it's become very mechanical. They're either withdrawn from the sexuality, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction in that area, or when they do relate sexually, it's very mechanical, and there's not a real exchange. Each person's in their own head. They're not really relating to one another. In an ideal relationship, there's an understanding and a lack of distortion of the other, seeing the person as they really are, with their weaknesses, with their strengths, seeing the whole person. And being seen in that way is one of the best feelings that we can get. It doesn't happen all that often. In a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, there tends to be misunderstandings of the others and distortions of them, either focusing on their negative qualities or their positive qualities or whatever it is we need from them, rather than really seeing them for who they are. And in an ideal relationship, people are non-controlling and non-manipulative and non-threatening. They ask for what they want from one another directly. They get their needs met directly. In a relationship that's characterized by a fantasy bond, there tend to be a lot of manipulations and a lot of dominance and submission. People tend to take roles with one another. Maybe one person plays out the child in certain parts of the relationship, the other person plays out the parents. There's tends to be a lot of manipulation of the other to try to get our needs met. And sometimes these manipulations are very overt, a lot of aggression, or the person who speaks loudest in the home. But there's also a lot of passive-aggressive ways that we manipulate our partners. Crying and falling apart whenever they say certain things is a huge manipulation. Threatening suicide is perhaps the strongest manipulation people can use in relationships. So there's also passive-aggressive means. We're now going to put on a film clip.
Yeah, I think I have time to show about 5 minutes of an 18-minute clip. But the first 5 minutes really make the point that we found that the combination of a satisfying sexual experiences, repeated in a loving relationship, combined with close emotional contact with your partner, really does raise death anxiety. And we're going to describe one of the major defenses then that kicks in as people start to withhold their attractiveness, their sexual responses, their affection, and they form instead this fantasy of still being close to each other. So I'll show the first two clips.
The one that was in? Yeah.
Eliason.
I'm in a situation right now where I'm in a relationship with a man that I know really does and respects me for who I am. And I feel like I'm at a point right now where I'm struggling because I don't quite know how to deal with it. Because I feel like I really feel like my life is precious right now, but that scares me. For me, I think I changed the situation that I'm in. I want to avoid that feeling. So for me, then, I start to withdraw. I start to withdraw those loving feelings. I move away.
Now, what Philip is describing is a typical example of withholding. Because when there's stress in a close relationship, even particularly when it's positive, the person will tend to hold back those qualities that are most desired or most desirable to the other. Most people say that they want love, admiration, closeness, long-lasting ties, loving relationships. But it turns out that they're really very refractory to those types of experiences. They find that they tend to recoil rather than to move toward those very gratifying experiences. They tend to pursue them up to a point and then become afraid and move themselves. And this seemingly illogical response to something that everybody really does want on some level is worth talking about, is worth trying to understand.
Naomi recounts an experience that tempted her to step outside her self-protective defenses and take another chance on being accepted and loved. Here she describes her childhood situation.
Both my parents were very self-centered and that they didn't have that much to give. They didn't have loving feelings to give. And I think growing up, nothing was drawn out of me. No loving feelings were drawn out of me. And I was kind of left to be by myself.
How did you feel in that state?
I felt.
Were you angry?
I felt rejected. I felt hurt. And I felt like I would go for the loving, like I would want that. I knew that that loving feelings existed somewhere in life. You know, I knew that there was some hope somewhere. So I would go for it, but then I was rejected. So I withdrew everything that I wanted to get or wanted to feel. I withdrew and I took it back in myself. And this happened all the way until I was 18, and then I met Steve and his family, who was very different towards me. And they took me in immediately with loving feelings and caring feelings that I've never, ever experienced. So here I am in a situation where now suddenly I'm having loving feelings directed towards me and being seen for a person I've never been seen as before. And I can accept it, but then I turn around and I think that life is so short. And immediately those feelings go away because I think it would be so painful to lose what is being directed towards me. All through my childhood, I was so proud of myself because I felt like I wasn't afraid of dying. But I realized the reason why I wasn't afraid of dying was because I didn't have that much to lose.
You didn't care.
I didn't care. And now I care. Now I'm really afraid of dying.
So how do you react to Steve in relation to, being vulnerable and so on?
Well, I feel like that if we're in a situation where it feels like we're two equal people and we're both sharing the same feelings of life in general, and this would be just like, for example, one moment that we're sitting together and we're talking and we're expressing really thrilling feelings, but also painful feelings. And but it's a very much where we're two people looking outward together. It's looking at life together. And he would maybe express a loving feeling towards me, And it would be really thrilling. I would feel so seen and so loved and so much like I have wood. You know what I mean? That it just feels so good. But after that, I really will turn around and have a thought. Like, life is so short, you know? And in response to that, I would act nasty. Or I would say something that was critical. Or I would just be withholding. He would bring me... Disrupt that thing. But, yes, and also like an hour... Right. Or an hour later, he'll come and say, you know, there's something wrong. And I would really think about it. You know, I think, no, nothing's wrong. But then I realize what I've done is I've taken away from him the kind of person I was when we were having that moment. Because even though I may not be acting nasty or critical or any way that other people could see, it would be very subtle. I wouldn't be the way I was, thrilled and excited. I'd be kind of dead and cut off to those feelings. I'd be cut off to the loving feelings, to feelings about my life. And he notices that because it's an intimate relationship.
This was the part about couples. We have about 13 more minutes before we get into a couple of other subjects about the other defenses against death anxiety and about ethnic strife, how it's related to it. But I didn't know if I would give you an opportunity because it's 12 o'clock, it's lunchtime. If anybody would like to see it later, I'll be happy to show.
Okay, good.